the best team in the world. Now, true, they came in the best team in the world, mainly based on online performances, an aggregate of playoff placings, and then one tournament of incredible dominance at DreamHack Marseille, where they only lost one map, and that was like a 16-14 to Team Liquid, or overtime, one of the two. So, yes, they did look absolutely fantastic. Then you saw what they did at IM Sydney. They were convincingly taking care of everyone. Mouse Sports, Fnatic. No one could do shit against them. In the final, they were playing against FaZe, who themselves had looked very ropey in this tournament, who'd actually played against Astralis in the round of 8 at DreamHack Marseille and gotten taken care of very easily there. So, yes, Astralis was expected to handedly win this best of 5 final. In fact, it was a best of 5. Should have even slanted it even more in their favour. They were expected to win 3-0, 3-1 at worst, but certainly to win. Instead, they didn't win a map in the final. They lost 0-3. And so, while this will immediately bring to mind again, did they choke? What went wrong in these close games? Losing close games has obviously been another kind of narrative all throughout their careers. I don't think that one's reasonable to call a choke, but it does remind you of some of their issues in close games over the years, and especially those egregious ones, the really bad chokes. In fact, so many over the years that I can't really run through all of them and dissect them all individually. So this is going to be more trying to figure out, who do you really blame for that? Who really gets to carry some of that with them as like they were an integral part of the choke? How do you decide, was it the whole team? Was it one individual? Because there's obviously a lot of ways you could break this down, right? Like, when it comes to a team choking repeatedly in these big moments, is it the in-game leader? Is the in-game leader not making the game-winning call? Or even worse, making a key call that absolutely loses you the game? Because, you know what, you could certainly say, okay, maybe the in-game leader did make the right call, but it turns out his team couldn't execute it, despite it being a normal round, something from the playbook, something practice, something that's worked even earlier in the game and seemed to be the right call at this point in time. Maybe his players said they could do it, agreed with the call, but then nerves have affected them, and so minor faults in the execution mean that despite being the right call and his team agreeing to it, it doesn't get executed on, so it looks like he made the wrong call. Maybe his star player is off, and so even though it's the right call and everyone else in the team does their part, one of the key components messes that up. That certainly can be a factor that could make it look like the in-game leaders made the wrong call. Is it that the star player in the team just doesn't get those big frags at the key moment of the game? If so, just that alone, just not contributing with the kind of scoring, fragging load that you expect from your star player, that's going to already limit the team. Then, if you notice that this is happening in a big game and they're just not recovering and they're really down in the dumps, you're going to have to adapt on the fly and play a different style of Counter-Strike than what got you to that big semi-final or that final. So in that scenario, it's going to be for a very difficult adaptation, either for another player in the team or the in-game leader overall with his approach. So it's going to knock onto him and make him look bad, and also other members in the team might be put in uncomfortable situations. Then you've got to add in that if a star player goes missing, it's going to crush the mentality of some of the other players. Not necessarily all of them. It's going to be very dependent on who they are as personalities, what their own temperament is like, because it's the opposite to when you have a very clutch star player. So, for example, in the past, we think of someone like a coldzera. To some degree, someone like Guardian in the past, I think of as a very clutch star player. Get right. When you have these players, I've noticed it can lead to a trickle-down effect where, because you know that they're so clutch and they seemingly always come through and save you, it starts to make the people who are borderline, they're not necessarily very clutch players, but not necessarily players who choke. The ones who are just in the middle, they tend to sort of be pulled almost gravitationally or by some sort of momentum of seeing how great the player who is their star is, towards being a little bit more clutch, towards making one extra little play, towards being able to feel safe that they can play their spot and do something simple for the team, knowing that they've got an amazing player behind them who can still win the round for them, who might make the game-winning play. It doesn't put as much pressure on each individual player to be a hero or to be the GOAT and to lose the game for everyone, using it in the classic sense. They're not the greatest of all time respect. So I think that confidence and the history of success of the star players has the knock-on effect, but people don't acknowledge that it goes the other way. When your star player has a tendency to disappear, I think this also makes more pressure for the lesser players, for the players who are in the middle. Also makes them think, oh, fuck, is he going missing? Oh, I mean, I can't carry the whole game myself. Or are we going to lose this one? You know, it can start to degrade those guys, and that is a knock-on effect that I don't think people acknowledge, even though it's not necessarily directly the fault of that other player who isn't a star in this sex. Then you've got the scenario of, is it the culture within the team? Maybe every player's fine. Maybe every player could go to a different team, or the in-game leader could lead a different team, or you could change one player from the team, and everything would be fine in this squad, actually. There wouldn't be any choking, there wouldn't be these issues, but either the culture coming from a player, coming from the in-game leader, coming from a combination, is creating this. And as a team, people just have no faith in these scenarios. They feel like they have to front run, or they feel like if they're behind, they feel, oh, is this going to happen for us? Oh, this is the team we always lose to. You could certainly see that happening. So that can be a knock-on from in-game leader, from star issues. It could be about having the wrong balance of temperaments. You've got too many people who get nervous. You've got too many people who don't exude confidence. Too many people who can't play a leadership role or can't lead by example in the game. Or the skill sets in the team maybe aren't as ideal. Like you have players who can only play in a loose style, perhaps. You could compare this to the FaZe Clan in recent times and stuff. That works, great. But otherwise, if it doesn't, you fall back. You haven't really got a team structure there. Again, balancing out the skill sets. The question you obviously want to ask beyond all these abstracts is it one individual? Is it all the team? Is it just a few members of the team? This is why you have to kind of dissect it. And it's always going to be tricky. And as time goes on, maybe your perspective will change on what happened in the past at that point in time. Because part of me does think that when a team, especially like Astralis, where the core of this team was in so many scenarios that they choked away, not always brutal chokes, but oftentimes failing to move on, to show up to big games where they were 50-50 or a slight favourite. I mean, you look at the majors, obviously eventually they got to be winning championships in 2015, going into 2017 when you have Glaive. But you have to consider this is a core that until the last major was in the round of 8 or better of every single major and made numerous top fours. In fact, they're very high up in the record for the most top fours for any core at a major, but they've only ever played in one final. They've only won one major, and even then that was in very close fashion in the third map. So this is a team that actually is already, in the top 10 of all time lineups to ever play. A bunch of these lineups would be, 2 of them probably. But you look at them, they could have achieved so much more. They're not a team that maximized. They didn't overachieve. They didn't get all the victories. They didn't do amazing things like some of the Fnatic teams did. They always were slightly missing that extra gear. And so you have to question, especially since the majors are the tournament with the most pressure, where people are the most likely to feel these nerves and these issues. The fact that it sometimes happened at lesser tournaments and then they got over that, but then it was happening at the big tournaments. Yeah, you have to start asking, is it more than one person? Because it doesn't seem like one person, I mean, even if it is a device or someone, could really be failing that hard and that consistently that it could crush the whole team unit and he'd never win any of these games. Especially not in teams that some of these teams were very deep in terms of skill set balance, in terms of raw ability, in terms of consistent performance by many of the players. They often had very cohesive styles. With that said, just because it isn't one player doesn't mean everyone shares equally in the blame and that everyone's automatically to blame. I mean, you see some of these players at different times play in a clutch manner, play up to the big game, and then other times have failures. You see some of them in other teams be successful and then otherwise have issues. So you got to look at it. First of all, in terms of the choking story in this team, this core, goes back to the days when they were Dignitas. Now, 2013, when they were Copenhagen Wolves, I don't think reasonably you can say they were choking then, because as a team, they weren't ready. As star players, they weren't ready to be champions. They were still on the way up, so losses against the number 1, number 2, number 3 teams in the world and in round of 8s and semi-finals were actually par for the course. That is what was supposed to happen back then. So no, I wouldn't really call that choking at that point in time. They were still on their way up. And on occasion, they arguably overachieved on certain maps. Then you get to 2014 when they got Kjun B back in the lineup and they were right there as a team with the other elite teams, with Ninjas in Pyjamas, with Titan, the former Very Game squad, with Virtus.pro who'd risen up and won the major. And yet, this year and at this period of time, they didn't win any titles. They didn't make any international finals. They would always lose to those big name teams in the big game, in the big semi-final. We often did see Device disappearing, and this is where the narrative came. I will fully say I was one of the people who propagated this and kept track of it because it was a notable absence from a developing star talent on a big team that looked capable of matching up with these squads, of making it further, but never did. It was most notable that they did have these chokes at the majors. They were in the semi-finals of 2 of them, and they blew the last one where they could have made a semi-final, and they never got to any of the finals. At Katowice in 2014, they lost to NIP after they just themselves smashed Hellraisers, looked amazing, came in, somewhat fell apart against NIP. NIP went to the final. Then you had Cologne afterwards. They played the Fnatic team there, who themselves, it was actually Fnatic's second tournament with that lineup, and Fnatic was close to winning that final. This should have been an amazing semi-final. It was on one map, wasn't beyond that. They collapsed to beyond that. And even though, again, they had a great map pool, they had a decent matchup against Fnatic. Then you go over to the last tournament of the year, the last major of the year was DreamHack Winter. Now, on paper, they were playing Na'Vi there, a team they matched up well against. They even had options as to what to do in the veto. They did this ridiculous veto where they picked Cobblestone up. They'd never played before because also they knew Na'Vi had never played it. They bombed that. They lost a close game on Mirage and they were done in the round of 8 where actually everyone thought they're going to be in the semi-finals. They're going to play LDLC then. That'll be another mini final before the finals. So instead, that one they even blew just outright before they got to the semis and against a team they were favoured to beat. Then you get to 2015, they get Carrigan as their in-game leader. Immediately, they're better. They're already beating Fnatic in best of 3 series, beating Virtus.pro in best of 3 series. They're getting these big wins over the teams that had haunted them in the past. They go on a spree of winning international tournaments. They won 3 big titles in a row. But they come to the majors, same exact problem as before. Very similar in nature, despite a different in-game leader, despite players having developed and become more star players at this point in time. They still, beyond even the majors, lost a lot of close semi-finals, lost a lot of finals, despite actually over the year winning 5 titles, one of the most successful teams of the year. They still underachieved to some degree. You get to 2016, okay, as a team, they began to fall off with this core. They were still having close series. They obviously had the MLG Columbus run at the major, which was epic, but still fell off there. The latter part of 2016 saw them losing to more and more teams, having bad placings, no longer making finals or semis as often. And obviously, crucially at this point in time, when NiP themselves were a good but not elite team, they would go back to losing to NiP because that core still had that psychological component. The seeds were still there from 2014, even though in 2015, in a number of occasions, actually, this team was able to overcome NiP and get past them and overcome those particular issues and beat them up in a bunch of times. Then you get to the point where Glaive joins towards the end of the year. Okay, they had some issues early on. They lost the IEM semi-final to SK where they looked like they were going to end SK's train streak. They lost the Series 2-0 anyway. They lost the E-League E-League Season 2 final to Optic, despite the fact they'd themselves already beaten NiP, their older nemesis. They'd beaten SK, best team in, well, not best team in the world necessarily, but certainly one of the best, and ended their streak on train. They'd seemingly done the hard work. Then they faced Optic, who looked to have done them a favour by taking out Carrigan's FaZe, and FaZe themselves had taken out VP. Everything was set up to win E-League Season 2 and start their period of dominance early. They didn't. They had to wait a week or so, go to play Optic in the ECS final, and this is where the period of strength came about, where there was nothing like choking. They won ECS Season 2, they won the major, they still had top 4 at DreamHack Vegas, only a monstrous VP could beat them. They had IM Katowice, where they were impressive throughout the whole tournament. They had this really great run of form where they won 3 out of 4 tournaments, but yeah, sure, maybe it could have been 4, maybe it could have been 5, maybe it could have been 6. They're not really that reasonable though. A lot of those losses, except, I would say, the E-League final and then moments of the E-League major, there wasn't really a whole lot of choking there. There was a lot of decisive matches, in fact, and a lot of really consistent play. You look after that period of time, they still were a very strong team. Obviously, they had SLTV. They were around from winning the tournament. They had IEM Sydney, where they played a great game against FaZe, but FaZe had their number. They played ECS Season 3, where they lost to SK in an epic semi-final. PGO Krakow, obviously, they beat SK, but then they had to play against Gambit and lost a close series there. So with the Glaive era, I would say it was more losing close games and sometimes device choking and being questionable. But as a core, I don't think it's reasonable to say Astralis was losing as much. I think aspects of in close games, they were sometimes playing teams that were incredibly clutch. SK, for example. In scenarios where device disappeared, other people did really well. They made the game really close still, and therefore they either won or they lost in close fashion. Sometimes they were picking maps that maybe weren't ideal. I don't think you can really put it on choking in the Glaive era. So we're talking mainly 2014 to 2016 in terms of the choking period. So now that we've got that established, we've got some history out of the way, let's look at some of the players involved in these chokes and ask how much were they involved in it. So let's start with in-game leaders, because obviously in-game leader can determine a lot in the game, and oftentimes these narratives follow in-game leaders around. It's not just their players. So obviously in 2014, they had the leader who'd brought them up from 2013, FeTiSh, legendary source in-game leader. Now, I will say, FeTiSh did have, I don't think he was the best in vetoes. They always had strong map pool in this core. So I would say sometimes maybe he didn't veto ideally and thought from practice, because famously Dignitas was an amazing practice team. Thought from practice, this is a good map for us, but in LAN play with any kind of nerves or discomfort, sometimes that's going to be a better team map for the opponent. And in a lot of the period of 2014, I will say, they often weren't favourites to win these big matches that they choked in. But they also didn't make them close and didn't make them epic series. And so even if they lost to a team slightly ranked above them, they should have been able to at least give them a match to really threaten them, whereas they didn't. And a lot of these teams, the Fanatics of the world, the Nips of the world, were more than happy to play against a team like a Dignitas later on TSM and say, yes, thank you very much. Well, they weren't TSM during this era, but yes, thanks very much. I'm glad I'm playing this team rather than NIP, Virtus.pro, Verity Games, Titan, whoever it might be at that point in time. I will also say, yes, he clearly had a more limited style, which I think exacerbated the choking, which is famously they had amazing CT strength as a general team. Now, first of all, that put a lot more pressure to have those CT side wins. So if you know you're not going to have a good T side, it's even more important you get the 12 rounds on the CT side, so then you can grind out or fluke your way through a T side. Then when you get to the T side, having not a very effective T side, and one that, even though you've got one of the best entry fraggers in Dupri, it means that you're not really going to have as much confidence from that. So that naturally, I can already see that feeding into when a game's going badly. You're going to lose a lot of close games. You're going to have a lot of games where you choke it away if you just had a mediocre CT side and you don't show up overall to the match. You don't have the same parity where you can have a strong T side and have a strong CT side, like the Titans, Virtus Pros, and NIPs of the world certainly did have. They had a lot more strength on both sides. They had also, I will say, in terms of FeTiSh, he was dealing with younger players. Device and Dupri, yeah, were the same players when in terms of skill set when they got to 2015 with Carrigan, but they were a year younger when they were playing with FeTiSh. They hadn't had the experience of making it through those matches. So while on the one hand, I don't think he made use of them, I think Carrigan made better use of these players. I have to also say, maybe he helped them, or maybe he got them during their worst period and they were getting over some of those issues anyway when they came to Carrigan. So again, you can't put all the blame on FeTiSh here. I do think he played a role though. And then you do have to say the fact that after this team, a lot of people might not know because they weren't around then, is after FeTiSh was kicked from the team that was Dignitas and then later became TSM, he actually went down when Dignitas then, when they became TSM, Dignitas then picked up the second best Danish squad and they picked up FeTiSh to be the leader of that squad, and it had some good players in this team. Well, actually, he immediately showed some of the same issues and collapses and breakdowns for the qualifier for the next major, which was Katowice 2015, because at this offline qualifier, there were two Inferno games. Inferno actually a map that obviously his teams had always been able to play. They lost to Vox, which was Sponge's team, and they lost to Kaboom, which was Fallen's Brazilian team. Neither of these teams were vaguely elite level teams. These weren't teams you would have expected to be able to beat his squad, and certainly these breakdowns, he lost one of them in close fashion like 16-13, and got wrecked on the other one like 3-16. So these were like signs that if anything, you take some of the star players away, there clearly were issues with him as an in-game leader, and I do think he was a component in the choking. But the reason why it's so tough to tease it apart is you bring in Carrigan. Okay, Carrigan comes in, he has a looser playing style, he helps them win finally, they're making finals, they make their first final at Copenhagen Games, no, not Copenhagen Games, was that correct? Yes, it was actually. They were able to win tournaments. He obviously was able to get them 5 tournaments over the year, 3 in a row at one point in time. But you have to ask at the same point in time, would any of that have happened with FeTiSh? If they'd given a FeTiSh 3 more months, would he have got to a final? Would he have won a title? Tough to tell. I would say that they would definitely won more with Carrigan. But yeah, maybe some of the issues they went through with FeTiSh was like easing the jar off. And then Carrigan came in. He either saw a very quick fix. He just implemented his style and very quickly they had success as they did. He obviously did a great job with their map pool, adding in a map like Overpass, which has just been reworked. I'd say I give a lot of credit for the success to him. But I also think you look in the majors and you're having similar chokes. But this time, oftentimes when you're a favourite or you're in a position where, yeah, you absolutely could win these games. And so some of these chokes in some senses are worse. Like at Katowice that year, NIP wasn't in amazing form. They just brought in Alu and they'd switched out the Makalele lineup. So actually their first tournament with Alu, this is when you're primed to be able to beat them. You get a 1-1 series, you go into the third map. The third map's Nuke, a map that Nuke, a map that Nip and this team have always loved. Both loved on the CT side. You have a great first half. You're in position to potentially win the game. It all falls apart. Nip wins in classic clutch fashion. They're clutch, you're not clutch. You choke away the game when you're in great position where it's very unlikely you lose the game at this point in time. It happens for you. You're on that CT side. You should have won. You don't. You go to Cologne. Cologne's one that's forgivable. They played Envious, who obviously had just made their own lineup change, was a very, very strong team. They also had an issue where Device's mouse got broken, apparently, by like an admin or something stupid. He still played pretty well. It was a close 3-map series. This one's not as bad. Envious was a team that actually had the stylistic and psychological matchup edge on TSM at this one point in time. But then you come to Cluj-Napoca, and this was unforgivable. They went out in the round of 8 with none of the elite teams on their side of the bracket. They were playing NIP in the first round, a team they'd beaten up a few times already at this point in the year and who weren't close to a top team. They had Na'Vi after that, who they'd been able to handle somewhat when they'd faced them and were favoured to beat. They should have been in the final, and they should have potentially been able to even win this tournament. You imagine if G2 had actually won that Inferno game, they would have played G2 in the final and probably won a major. So this one was pretty unforgivable. You go beyond his time. At Columbus, they're able to thrash Fnatic, best team in the world. Hasn't been stopped, won 6 tournaments in a row. They thrash them, go play Na'Vi, and collapse after a poor end to the first map. You come to Cologne, okay, that's not their fault under Carrigan. They didn't have Dupri for the playoffs. They obviously didn't have Kjun due to the roster lock. They had to bring in Glaive. They had to use Zonic. They still had a great performance in the round of 8 against Virtus.pro. Was still close to getting to top 4, so I don't blame them for that one. So we're seeing there's a couple where it's not a choke, there's no problems. There's a couple where it's an egregious choke, and there's other ones where it's like still questionable, like the Na'Vi one at Columbus. So clearly there was still some choking at the majors. Then you look in 2016 when the team generally fell down in level, and people like Kjun B, people like Carrigan, people like Dupri start to have issues. Yes, clearly there was some choking going on this year, and that continued after Kjun B left and the Kjun change was made. So again, can't just be Kjun B, right? I would have to say, as an in-game leader, I think the team lost faith in Carrigan in 2016, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And because of this choking in moments where they lost comfort, and it wasn't like being as free as playing in a normal tournament where they could win, they wanted to go back to more structure, to more the classic Danish style, to offset some of the issues by having preparation there, by having an A, B, C, D plan that you could go with and not have to rely on someone being able to play at a peak level, which they weren't able to do as well as the NIPs, the Virtus.pros, the SKs, the Fnacs of the world, these teams that could play a little bit more loose. You have to look at the fact that even with multiple roster moves, Kjun coming in, later on Glaive coming and Carrigan get kicked out, some of those issues still trailed them. Some were still present, even when you change out 2 of the players. So I have to say, you look at Carrigan after Astralis when he went to FaZe. Once FaZe loaded up and got Nico and were now in position to be one of the best teams in the world, he's had the same problems. That FaZe lineup with Nico obviously made all those finals, only won one of them. Made 5 semis in a row, only won 1 title. Then they go to the major, bomb out last place. Then you have his lineup with Guardian, Olaf Meister. Amazing lineup, right? Fabulous players. They win a couple of titles in dominant fashion, more dominant than even some of the TSM lineups in the past. Go to the major, yeah, what do you know? They bombed the major. They were in, well, okay, that sounds ridiculous, I guess. They didn't bomb the major. They obviously made the final of the major. It was exceptional. It's his first ever major final. But the way they played in the final of the major, relative to how they'd played in these big tournaments before, was basically bombing it. Like, they'd done the hard work already again, and they were in position to win, and they'd have a classic letdown. And guess what? There's no other Astralis player in this team except Carrigan, so he's got to take some of the blame. The thread follows him into his team there, and then obviously after that, before that, they lost to SK in a bunch of those close finals that were winnable. And then after that, they had the series of run in FaZe where they lost to Mousesports later on. Let me think, what am I talking about? Mousesports. No, they obviously won the Mousesports one, but they lost to a number of teams, close ones. NIP, Fnatic. These were matches, Na'Vi. These are matches they were all favoured to win, but they lost, and to some degree there was a choking element involved in it. So, yeah, you know what? Carrigan has to carry some of the blame there. And since he was actually there during the period the team was at its best, in some ways it's worse. It's not. FeTiSh was a much worse leader. I'll blame him a lot more for some of those chokes. The fact that Carrigan could win sometimes offsets it, but still some of these wins, because the team's so exceptionally good and all-time great, in some ways become worse, if you know what I mean. It's more underachieving in a bizarre sense. Then you get to Glaive. As I said, I don't really see Glaive as part of a choking problem or part of any issue. He seems actually to have been quite key early on in offsetting these issues and getting them over them. I mean, yes, admittedly at the major, they could have blown it both in the Swiss system and in the final, but they didn't. And so the fact that they didn't surely is credit to Glaive in that particular sense, especially the way he called in that major third map final on train. Then you look, okay, yes, Astralis under Glaive lost a lot of close games. But they didn't really choke them, did they? They often played well in these close games. Often a lot of these were classics. That's actually often a sign of a fabulous leader. I would say that Ave didn't choke that much in 1.6, but he lost a lot of close games. He made a lot of top 4s and didn't win the tournament. So it's not always the same to lose a close game or to lose in the semis as it is to choke it and not turn up. So I would say overall, to differing degrees, yes, FeTiSh and Carrigan, for my money, were clear issues, but in very different fashion though. Then you look at the players in Astralis. Okay, so as I mentioned, Device before, the most famous player attached to the choking. In 2014, he wasn't the clear-cut star player of the team. He didn't think of himself as it. He was one of a cadre of stars. They had him, they had Dupri, they had Zipnick was emerging as a good player. At certain points in time, they had Kjun. 2015, though, Device does emerge as the best player in the team and one of the best players in the world, which made his issues even more apparent. Because now it's not like, oh, one of our stars didn't make it, so where are the other ones? And then if they don't turn up, oh, okay, everyone collectively had a bad game. No, now he did have times that were terrible. Like at the majors that year, he was one of the players in that nuke game at VeXii in the third map against NIP in the round of 8, who did not turn up while people like Get Right made her hero plays, and he went missing and lost the series. Then you have Cologne, even though he had the mouse issues, this one was good actually. He was actually very good in this series. Don't blame him for that one. He, some degrees, had gotten over it. But Cluj-Napoca, he was one of the main reasons they shit the bed at this one. He really collapsed entirely, despite looking like a top 2 player in the world at the time. And you have to put some of that on him, even though, yes, you put it on Carrigan as well for some of the issues they had there. You come in 2016, 2017. Yes, he's gotten to some degree over some of his choking issues. It doesn't happen as often. He becomes an extremely consistent player, fabulous from tournament to tournament to tournament. Even in majors, has good stats, but has notable letdowns. And that's the thing. He still has the big moment letdowns, the big game letdowns, the major letdowns. At Columbus, he wasn't the guy who went as ham against Fnatic. That was actually Dupri. And then when it was in against Na'Vi, a map that they really need, a series they really needed him on, he had something of a letdown towards the end of the first map on Inferno, and then was somewhat non-existent after that. You go to Cologne that year, which is where they didn't have Dupri, they didn't have Kirby. I feel like the fact that all pressure was off them, they weren't expected to win. He played great that tournament, I have to say. He didn't have any letdowns. Didn't make it to the semis either, so maybe there wasn't the big stage to have the letdown, but he didn't have one. Then you get to the E-League Atlanta. Now, what's weird here is he is godlike right up until the final. Even in the third map of the final, he gets it going and he actually has some key AWP kills to win them the game. But yes, the final overall, he did go missing. He did have a choke. It was underwhelming, but he was so exceptional for the rest of it. They never could have been in that final without him against Fnatic, against Na'Vi in some of the group stage games. So it's mixed because on the one hand, he's been incredibly clutch and amazing throughout the tournament. But then, yes, he did go missing big time in that final. Obviously, other finals we think of, the E-League Season 2 final, he had some maps he went missing. You go beyond that to 2017 at PGL Krakow. Now, on the one hand, he takes care of SK himself, is amazingly clutch against arguably the best team in the world. Then you get to the semis, and him getting out-opt massively by Mo on Overpass, Astralis' map, is a big reason as to why they lose that series. Even though, yes, on the third map, Train, he was one of the reasons they were back in position to be in the driving seat and maybe win it and go forward to the final. So clearly, he had his big letdowns. He's someone who has had very bad issues of choking, but as the years have gone on, has gotten better, but has never fully overcome it. Like, he'll have one tournament he really chokes at, and one that he can get back from. So for me, he is clearly part of the choking issue. In terms of the star power, he is, certainly. And he seems to be plagued by somewhat idiosyncratic letdowns and issues of his own that seem to be outside of the context of his leader or the atmosphere of the team even. Then you come to Dupri, obviously part of the double D combination, been there the whole time. Now, he's never been expected to be the main star, but he's been one of the stars, and at times been the sidekick, the co-star, whatever you want to call him. Now, I would say, again, much like Device, he's always had good stats at the majors. He's always been a very consistent player at the majors. He hasn't often played up to superstar level at the majors, I will say. He's had a couple he played at where he was amazing. He's often just played very well. So, okay, you can say he's consistent. With that said, though, if you go and look at a lot of their elimination series at these majors, yeah, he's often someone who's just playing mediocre there, or okay. Now, he never had many of the games where he completely disappeared like Device and completely choked the match. Yes, he often played stable, but just not star-level Counter-Strike. So in a way, he kind of gets to hide in the shadow of Device's failures, but he didn't necessarily play elite Counter-Strike himself, like a Flusher, like some of the other Guardians, some of the other all-time great players at some of these majors. Yeah, so you have to say to some degree he's contributing to the choke, even though I think his in-game leader and his star player maybe were doing worse, and therefore he could have played the same way. And with a clutch in-game leader or star player, maybe would have won the match. So he takes a small bit of blame. He often was underwhelming in the final series, but I don't think you can put too much of it on him. You have to look at Kjun B, because I have to say, for what a fabulous player he could be and what a luxury he could be for his teams at times, he didn't have that many standout matches at Majors often, and you didn't rely on him to be the star, but he also wasn't going to be. Like, if Device and Dupri went missing at a Major in a key match, it's not like Kjun would just take over the game. That didn't seem to happen as much as it happened in normal international tournaments. With him, though, his main issue throughout his career has not really been choking or lack of confidence. It's more been rage issues. So for me, that's the difference between choking and tilting. I know people often conflate the two. For me, tilting is more like you get mad at yourself and you throw yourself off your own game, and that's why you're tilted. Choking's more like, yes, you are wrecking yourself, but it's more on some emotional level, or you're totally out of the game in terms of your headspace and you can't play the match. That's a very different kind of a mistake and a thing to affect you. So I wouldn't really count Kjun generally in it, even though I have to say, when he went to Dignitas/North, they also had a lot of major letdowns, had a lot of close games and a lot of matches where they seemed to bomb it. But I have to say, generally, he was pretty good in most of those. He wasn't one of the reasons I thought really for those that he was failing. He tended to be pretty consistent. It was people like a Magisk or an MSL who were having their own issues over there. Zipnick, I don't think you can put any of the blame on him. This is one of the great things about Counter-Strike is it doesn't really work to just look at the result and say that defines the player, because Zipnick is one of the most clutch players to ever play Counter-Strike in any version, but CSGO especially, and yet he's on a team that's one of the most famous for choking and losing close games. So it shows that even though he's balancing some of their negatives out, he can't balance all of them out. And if he's got 2 or 3 players who are a problem, yeah, that's not going to overcome it. In the same way as when Dignitas had no T-side, Dupri could still be one of the best entry players in the world. They're not mutually exclusive propositions. So I don't put any blame on Zipnick whatsoever. So if we add it all up and we kind of take an aggregate, in terms of in-game leader issues, okay, FeTiSh having no T-side and seemingly weak motivational skills and not being able to get his team to buy in or believe that they're going to win, I think that's a problem. When it gets to Carrigan, it's different because he had some problems for a while, but he also had the team believing for a while, for maybe a solid year. Yes, eventually they lost faith in his approach because his approach has generally been put a lot of onus on the stars, give them free room, give them responsibility, and sometimes those stars showed that they couldn't live up to the responsibility, or worse, didn't want the responsibility by the end. Hence, I think to some degree, that's why some of the Device chokes looked really bad under Carrigan, because a lot of it was riding on Device being able to have the autonomy to make decisions and to be a big star player. And this was actually the era, 2015, where sometimes he'd shy away from AWPing because he didn't feel it and then just become a rifler and take away some of the impact that Carrigan wanted in his team, wanted from his star player, wanted from a player who's going to turn loose and used in a very different way as an AWPer than someone like Glaive did. I also think when you look at some of Carrigan's issues when he goes to FaZe, ironically, though, not against Astralis, which makes you think he actually knows how to make Astralis uncomfortable from his time in the team, but he's had his own problems against SK. He's had his own problems in finals. He's underachieved even with FaZe, despite making FaZe one of the all-time great cores to ever play Counter-Strike. So I feel as though in some ways he wasn't as bad as FeTiSh for the choking, but in other ways he had his own problems, or some of his strengths misaligned with the strengths and the comfort levels of the Astralis players, and therefore, while a very successful combination, maybe it wasn't the perfect combination. You get to Glaive, he seems to lessen all of the issues that these guys had before, and therefore, you have to put some of the blame on the in-game leaders. But then you get to the players. So as stars, yes, I think Device clearly... Bizarrely, there's never been a player, I think, as good and as great as him in CSGO who had as many big letdowns. So that is tough. With that said, it's not all the time anymore, so it can't be him all the time who's making you lose all these matches. So again, can't just be him, but clearly as a star and as an individual player, he's a big part of their chokes. Just something he's got to work with himself. That seems to just be a character flaw that he has. You get to Dupri. Okay, as I said, Dupri's had his problems, but he also then again, especially when he was the entry fragger, has played a very tough role. I would say that it was even harder for him in that role in 2014 since they didn't have a very good T-side and had FeTiSh as the in-game leader. So it's even harder for me to put too much of the blame on him when he doesn't turn up in the big elimination series. But for 2015, 2016, yes, there were times that despite being a fabulous player, he didn't necessarily come with the star level performance I expected of him in this kind of a squad. If your 2 stars and your in-game leader have issues to varying degrees and have chokes and have times they don't turn up, that alone could limit any top elite team from winning. That could be enough right there. So I don't think Kjun was necessarily a great balance personality-wise for the team. Was he part of the choking? I don't really think so. I think he was something of a non-factor either way on that respect. Zipnick's, I think, was a great player in this team. I think it was a fantastic element. But then again, though, he's also not going to fulfill the vocal aspect, the leadership aspect, the motivational component. The way he wins is reliable, but it's not really a way that like pumps you up and makes you believe you can win. You know, oftentimes you're going to actually feel guilty that you put him in 5 1v3s and he could only win 1 or 2 of them, which is actually a very great fucking win percentage for that kind of a scenario. So for me, it was a combination of the 3 players. It was either FeTiSh, Device and Dupri, or it was Carrigan, Device and Dupri, but in differing degrees. I'd put Dupri on the lower end of that overall. I'd put Device as a player on the high end. I'd put the in-game leaders as in terms of their overall impact on the high end. I think that if the team had just had another clutch player, or if one of their star players had been clutch, or their in-game leader had just suited the style better, I think that the mismatch over the years was part of the problem in that respect. I think they would have won more of these matches. I think winning more of the matches would have had the knock-on effect of making people more confident. I think they wouldn't have been riddled. I think people like Dupri wouldn't have as much of an issue. If Device was stronger, I think Device might not have as much of an issue. If his in-game leaders fit him better. I think there was a bunch of these scenarios that, yes, apportion blame according to these, but they're also kind of, in a way, there's a symbiotic nature to the choke, I think. So for me, the DNA of the team was very interesting. But that's also something where the DNA maybe had a few flawed genes, as it were. Maybe they needed a more vocal leader. Maybe they needed someone who could be more hands-on when they were choking. Maybe they needed someone who was able to psychologically deal with these things and rally people to the cause and kind of be a Taz or a Fallen in this particular sense. So I don't think you can blame one person. I definitely don't think you should blame all the people. I think it's clear when you look at a couple of people, 2 or 3 having their issues as to why this has been a continuing problem, because it's never just one of them. It's never always the same one, but the problems continue. And I think you have seen the problems continue out with certain people into other teams and different lineups, which suggests that there is something in the DNA of the team that has had this choking. Even though at the moment, we can't really say in the Glaive lineup that it's been as prominent or as much of an issue. Although, yes, at times Device hasn't always turned up, including in the IM Sydney final. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset. And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.